Hi, everybody. This morning, I want to share with you a beautiful story that I read yesterday. It is a story that happened in China, in Wuhan, China, where this coronavirus started. So, this is a story around relationship, around healing. And more importantly, I think it is around how absolutely everything in time and space, absolutely everything in this world can be used as a learning device to serve the mind, to remember love and remember innocence. Actually, almost every day there are different news and different articles on social media that came to my awareness around coronavirus. And most of the articles and stories that I read or I come across with are stories about love, trust, and how people start to open up to each other in this very extreme situation and extreme period of time. They found something underneath the surface of everyday life and everyday roles that they used to play. And it's just really beautiful. But yesterday, my mom actually sent me this article. It is written by this young woman in her 30s. She has a husband and a son, and this small family lives in Wuhan, China. So in January, her mother-in-law, the husband's mother, came all the way from another city to Wuhan to live with the family for a period of time during the Chinese New Year. That's very traditional, very common for Chinese families. And then the mother-in-law and her have this very surfacey relationship. They hardly had any connection, real connection. They brought together by her husband, and they are, their families, but really they just try to live with each other and not really, push each other's buttons as much as they could. So this time in January, the mother-in-law arrived, and soon after, there were news that there was this very contagious virus spreading, and it was recommended that people should avoid going out as much as they could. So the family obeyed, except the mother-in-law. She just couldn't care less. She went out every day to shops, to markets, brought back tons of food in preparation for the biggest celebration of the year for the family. And 2 days before the New Year Eve, the government sealed the whole city. Nobody could really go out of the city. Nobody could go out of their house except occasionally for food. And then I think 2 days later, both herself and her mother-in-law started to have fever and other flu symptoms. By that time, the hospitals nearby were already too stretched or too full to even arrange a checkup. So after prioritizing their decisions, they decided that the first thing they would do is to send the husband and son away to a friend's house that had been vacant, so they would live separately. So now this woman and her mother-in-law had to live together. Not only that, they had to live together in this very extreme period of time, and both were sick. So, when they started, there were different meltdowns between the two of them because They had very different priorities. They really did not really like each other so much. And the mother-in-law really only cared about her son and the grandson, whether they're okay. So she was calling them almost every hour to make sure they were okay, they had enough food to eat. And then this woman was just furious, thinking, you brought this virus to the family, you don't really care about yourself, you don't really care about me. And all of this anger and frustration, also wanted to go to a hospital to get a proper checkup and couldn't do that. So all of these intense emotions rise up. So they didn't really want to be with each other. They just lived their day in separate rooms, hardly talk with each other. But they could hear, both are getting worse and getting weaker. They could hear each other running to the bathroom. And then one day, they came together for dinner, and neither could really eat by that time. They were too weak. And this woman got a phone call from her own parents in another city, asking whether she was okay or whether the family was okay. And she couldn't really tell her parents what was going on because there was just too much emotion and too much stress. So she had to lie to say that I'm okay, the family was okay, we're all together, spending the new year together. And she hung up the phone, trembling with the emotions and just like holding everything in. And then at the same time, she could hear the cutlery, noise, knowing the mother-in-law was eating her way, enjoying dinner, and this anger just was uncontrollable. But when she finally lifted her eyes up, she was surprised because the mother-in-law was crying very hard while trying to eat her dinner. I think that there was some kind of shift happened to the mother-in-law because she realized that this is someone else's daughter. She could not imagine, the kind of loss that the parents would feel. So in that moment, I think what happened was, in A Course in Miracles, Jesus said healing happens when you do not see the gap between you and your brother anymore, when you cease to see your brother as different from you, when there is no separate interest between you and your brother. And I think that's what happened to the mother-in-law. She actually rose up from this weakness and this fragile state, and she made a decision to make sure her daughter-in-law would recover. And that's what she decided in her mind. So from that point on, she just forgot all about herself or her son or grandson. She just focused on serving her daughter-in-law day in and day out. She would cook a feast every day to make sure she would eat, to build up her immune system. And she would use all kinds of tricks to force her to do a little bit of exercise, to eat, just to build up some immune system. And then one night, I think this woman in the middle of the night went to the bathroom and saw the light was on in her mother-in-law's room. And she opened the door. She saw that her mother-in-law was praying for her, kneeling on the floor, praying for her and her alone to recover. And in that moment, all the resentment she had was gone. And she decided to join her mind in going through it together without any without any filter and without any grievance from the past or from anything. So they started this journey every day, and joining and talking and trying all kinds of things. And 2 days later, the mother-in-law recovered. The fever was gone, and they couldn't believe it. They tested it again and again. They laughed, they cried, they were extremely emotional and excited. So, but that excitement didn't last very long, because this woman, her fever didn't go away. And there was still no news from the hospital. And she just started to get more and more depressed, especially now with the thought that she's living with someone who healed herself and she couldn't do it. So there was this shame and comparison, frustration, and then she locked herself in her room, refused to talk to her mother-in-law anymore, and just buried herself with tears every day. And the mother-in-law at the same time just kept going, trying to talk with her outside of the door for hours every day, and shared her own journey, how to let go of depression. And in that days of just listening and sharing, she realized that the mother-in-law went through so much, carried so much love and strength in her that she could never find out. And finally, she decided to open the door and come together again in this desire to just join and just not to isolate and just to be together. And very soon after, she got the news that the hospital was open and a bed was open. She could be taken to have a full checkup, as well as the mother-in-law would have a checkup and a quarantine. So the result of it was this young woman was confirmed to be affected by coronavirus when she got the checkup. But now she actually is recovering. And the mother-in-law's checkup was completely clean, negative. So I was very touched by the story and how two people were brought together, seemingly not of their own will, and definitely not in the condition that was ideal. You know, it was not the most pleasant condition. And yet, it was an assignment. Nobody can deny that. Sometimes we call this an assignment, like two people brought together purely for a very holy purpose of forgiveness, and made the situation be very intense, very unpleasant. Still, there is a huge gift and an opportunity to connect and join deeply and use that relationship for the purpose of not seeing a different self-interest, not seeing there is a difference between you and your brother anymore. And of course, we cannot choose our curriculum, because the curriculum, the assignments are actually given to us. But it is for us to accept and not to settle for less, because we can see that everybody has their own priorities in life and in a particular situation as well. It's rare for people to put aside their own priorities and their goals of a specific situation and truly come together to join. And in that desire and in that purpose, miracle happens, forgiveness happens, miracle happens. And that miracle of healing, brings the mind back to remembrance that miracle of healing reflects the wholeness of the mind and reflects the fact that sickness is not true. And I like that story also because it's just such a miraculous reflection of the state of mind of the mother-in-law. And as we are still talking about the coronavirus and accepting that it is something real, it is causative, it is something to be feared, I just like these kind of examples and stories that just breaks the law and the cause-effect relationship. You know, this is truly just a demonstration that healing happens in the mind, healing happens in joining, in real joining, and that is truly what anything and any situation in this world is about. You know, they seeing from the ego their own problems, and yet seeing from the spirit their own answers. And this is what we want to dedicate our days to look upon the world as answers from the spirit. And of course, the way to see it, we cannot use our past learning or our past experience. We have to ask the spirit to give this interpretation to us. So it is a very humble way of living, you know, to ask the spirit to tell us how to look upon the world, how to look upon everything. But it's so glorious because that's, you know, that is the experience when we are inviting the spirit's interpretation to saturate our mind in experience. We experience the love, we experience the wholeness, and we experience the miracles and the innocence and the trust, and how beautiful our relationships and assignments can be. Thank you. Thank you for joining me in that.